Welcome back to the Count Me In podcast. I'm your host, Adam Larson, and today's guest is really interesting, Casey Wu. Casey's been a strategic financial leader in Silicon Valley for the past 2 decades, investing in and operating high growth tech and tech enabled companies. He is the CFO of Landing, the former head of strategic finance at WeWork, and the co founder of Operators Guild, a knowledge sharing community for CFOs and other business operators. And that's just what he's been up to lately. Today, Casey and I put the microscope on the CFO and how the role has evolved from being the sheriff of cost and budgets to now being a company-wide business partner focused squarely on the most important metric of all, growth. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Casey, thanks so much for joining us today on the Count Me In podcast. We're going to jump right into some questions. We're going to be focusing in on the CFO. And so to start off, what are some common misconceptions or what is the historical perspective on the role of the CFO?
Yeah, I think I'm probably not going to be novel here in my answer. There is a pretty classic stereotype of a CFO. To borrow a phrase from a friend, there's CFO no. Is basically one of them is Dr. No. The Dilbert, the nickel and dimer, the no personality, the one that says no to everything in terms of costs. And other words, like the budget, right? The people think of my travel and expense reimbursements, like that's when you get to real stereotypes of just, don't you do my T&E reports? And then of course at the corporate level, CFOs are, I don't know, a misconception. Hopefully this is a good conception, but they're the honest broker, right? They're the one who engages with the board as the air quote pseudo check on leadership, et cetera. And so that's the misconceptions. Some of that's true. Absolutely, you have that. A lot of it now is not true. Yes, we manage budgets and money and have that purview. But I think there's also what's now called CFO grow rather than CFO no. And I do think there's a healthy way to manage in a very responsible way money, but also, and I think the word is invest, right? So they call it strategic CFO. Money is meant to be invested, I guess saved as well, right? So when you're especially in high growth, VCs are not giving you money to sit on it. It's put it to good use. And the word is good use, not reckless use. And of course, you got to balance a lot of things. So one is just a strategic-minded investor mentality of where you want to allocate resources is, I think, more what's happening. And it's not just about nickel and diming. There's also, more personalities CFOs than people think. It's very cross-functional. Some are extroverts. Most are not. But they can be a very friendly person who empowers and is a business partner rather than a police force.
So when we look at the space of a CFO as an operator, you talked a little bit to me about your Operators Guild. What personal experience do you have and what have you gained in this level of expertise?
For those who don't know, the Operators Guild has been going on for 8 years. It started as a 8-9 person friend group of operators that we support one another. Now it's about 600. I say this because there's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of learnings. So I'm only going to scratch the surface. A few things. One, all a business is, all a startup is a bunch of people who decide to get together at 8 a.m. to build something to sell for more than hopefully it costs. That's all a business is. Or a startup. Just call it a startup, call it whatever you want to call it. Just and notice it's humans. You take away the humans, computers are not going to do anything themselves. And that's number one, is business is a game. So when things are crazy or stressful, it's like no one's dying here. This is not real life and death. It's serious, don't get me wrong. We're very competitive, but there's a lot of natural dysfunction when you toss in money, growth, expectations, and people. Dysfunction is just basic. So that's kind of a learning. And also work with good people. It just goes back to business is just a bunch of people. It's not worth it. You can make your money elsewhere if it's not with good people who respect you, who you respect them, shared values. It's actually very similar to a marriage. It's just not intimate, right? But it's the same thing, shared values. You go on dates that are called interviews. You get divorces. It's because when things are not matching up. Another one is, don't let stereotypes or misconceptions tell you how you should act in your role. Play to your strengths. Establish yourself as, if you're going to be a strategic CFO, be one. That said, maybe you have a stronger person who complements you on the expense side, who's much more, doctor no, so to speak, right? They're all really, or vice versa. You're someone that's extremely cost conscious. You need to marry that with someone that's a little bit more strategically minded and growth minded. It just depends. That's just an example. But play to your strengths, be who you are, and hiring is super important. It's probably the key to everything. All things in startups are just problems. All we're doing is problem solving every day. If you can put together the right team, tools, resources, you can solve any problem. So those are kind of learnings.
Okay. No, that's great. I think that's really nice. And just thinking about the CFO, you talked my first question, you talked a lot about the misconceptions. I think you laid that out very nicely with the Dr. No and the Dilbert examples and stuff. But a lot of people tend to underestimate what the CFO sees because of these misconceptions that can be there. And if the CFO hasn't established himself as like a business partner, it can be very difficult to get a seat at the table. Can you talk a little bit about what the responsibility the CFO has to kind of get there so that they're not underestimated?
I think the first one is, before you get married, you should establish that. I would question a company where CFO is not at the table. Not because of CFOs, all that. It's just because it's too important of a function, just like CRO or CTO. So that's just point number one. If you're fighting to get there, sometimes it's already a little off, and you need to question how they value and what they expect from the function. If you're in the unfortunate seat of don't have a seat at the table, I think it's a very clear. I believe in explicit conversation and communication. It's like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. CEO, this is a function that's critical to the business. I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about the function. And for the sake of the business and our stakeholders, it's important that I'm in the room, or whoever's leading the function. Would you agree or disagree? If they disagree, I would seriously consider finding a place where you can make a bigger impact and be valued, because it should be a high impact role.
So you have the seat at the table. You're there with everybody. What does that look like? What does that CFO's responsibility look like today, as opposed to the stuff we've already talked about, the misconceptions and the Mr. No's and all that stuff?
The first thing is, I believe all functions should be business first, function second. Business first, legal second. Business first, accounting second. Business first, marketing second. Everything is in service of the business. So I think that's the first mindset you should have. The second is, there's a difference between tactics and strategy. Asking very important questions, I think, is actually something that people underestimate in terms of stirring conversation, getting to know the business better, and at a certain level. So I think when you're at that table, depending on your audience, you do need to operate and talk at a higher level and not get caught in the weeds. At the same time, to be at that table, you need to know the details. If you don't know the important details, they just call you ivory tower, right? You're just talking without really any true understanding of the business. So it's both. Understand the business well, but elevate up and talk at a very strategic high level. In terms of topics of conversation, I think generally I like to call it nonlinear. So rather than, we need more revenue, so I guess we need to grow the sales team. Like, okay, that's like tactical and sometimes obvious. It would be, if we have an asset heavy model, should we consider asset light? Have we tried to take this entire team and move them to a lower cost area? We do, one idea that was awesome, wasn't mine, but it's like, hey, we do host check-ins. What about self-service check-ins? So be a part of the business discussion, product discussions, and all of them, when you think about it, just lead to better allocations of capital. People think capital allocation is more of a budget. Product is a major allocation of capital. Where you spend it, what types of products generate what, the return on that. So that's really where I think the CFO now sits. And of course, there's fundraising. Right? The most unique thing about a CFO is that they really help with the capital needs of the business. So there's a whole bunch of strategy there. There's risks you take. There's intentional risks. There's unknown risks. And the last thing I think is preparing ahead. Seasoned operators, the benefit they bring is they see 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months out. Because a lot of times the breaking distance on these high growth companies are so far, you have to be making decisions today to affect 12 months from now. And unseasoned people, unfortunately, find out when the brick wall is in front of their face and you're going at 700 miles per hour.
That's quite a visual there. What you've been describing really kind of connects for me, like the CFO, how important they are with things like strategy and data and understanding those things and being able to present those things properly for the organization and giving the input that is there for the strategy when determining those things and having the right data in place to support that. Can we maybe focus a little bit on tools? Because when you're a CFO, you need the right tools at your disposal. Are there some common tools that help drive strategy? And maybe you can talk a little bit about innovation there. And I think what's most important for our listeners is, how do they go about getting their hands on these tools and learning from them and learning to use them? Because I think because you don't want to be that CFO with the brick wall right in front of you going 700 miles an hour. You want to be prepared and get to that point where you will become seasoned in that way you've described.
And the biggest change that I actually forgot to mention about misconception is I think the office of the CFO will eventually become the business intelligence center. Right now, BI can be living under itself. It can live under a COO. It can live under product and engineering is very common. But when you think about a centralized org, the CFO comes to mind. Why? Because we're finance. I think of it like a nervous system. Nerves have to be everywhere. The bloodstream, it has to be everywhere, but it feeds, nourishes, and helps and partners with, air quote, the organs or the functions of the business. So number one tool is data. So number one is having the data. Number two is clean data, which is the biggest and hardest one. After that, it's systems and tools to democratize and extract decision-making insights. That's what I think is where the CFO is headed. And this goes back to, I have a mentor who made a famous analogy of finance is like the weather. There's 3 levels, and the goal is to get to level 3, which most do not get to. Level 1 is reporting the weather. What happened yesterday? It was sunny. It was cloudy. That's just called reporting. Not easy to do well, but you get that done. After you get that done, level 2 is forecasting the weather. It's going to be it's going to be stormy. It's going to be dark. It's going to be sunny. Translation, forecast, P&L. The third is influencing the weather. I'd go as far as to say changing the weather. It's going to be stormy 6 months from now. We can do X, Y, and Z and make it sunny. That's data. The more data rich of businesses, the more complicated of businesses, the more power there is and influence there is to actually say, did you know that half our users are looking for this? So why don't we change our product to do that? It, sounds easy, but those make all the difference in the world times 100 of those. So the number one tool is business intelligence, which combines everything. It's not just about sitting on top of data. It's just not about a fancy system. It's putting it all together. And lastly, why is the CFO uniquely qualified, or the office of the CFO? Most people work in a function: sales, marketing, engineering. Their job is to focus and dedicate in one arena. The job of CFO is to tie it all together and help bring it all together. And then there's obviously, other functions like that too. But when you have finance, that's a lot of data as well. People forget that accounting is a crap ton of valuable data of all sorts. So the combination of accounting data, forecasting data, customer data, sales data, product data is, I think, going to be the future. And it's going to sit somewhere around the CFO space, obviously CEO space as well.
So I think that's great. Those tools sound very clear for the CFO as they're looking at that. As we wrap up our conversation, I think, I wanted to ask you, because I know that you're in a number of different ventures. Are there other opportunities out there for CFOs to connect with other CFOs so that they can help, build themselves up and just really, get the knowledge needed at a time?
I mean, selfishly, the answer is the best one I know is called Operator Skill. I co-founded it, like I said, as an innocent solve to a problem I had about 8-9 years ago. It's a wonderful community. And it's a great way to give back, mentor, mentee. So Operators Guild is the place, in my opinion, for the most value of getting support, giving it, learning, giving, and participating.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.